Whoever sows to please their flesh, from the flesh will reap destruction. Galatians 6:8. He was no stranger to blood, but hot, day-old, curdled blood was another matter. Another bead of sweat trickled to the small pool that had accumulated on the nosepiece of his fogged glasses. He could barely breathe through the blue surgical mask under the oppressive heat of the luminescent lamps. That it was late July and they were sheltered by walls made of heat-absorbing sheet metal did not help. His hands shook, and he thought his head would explode out of his eyes as he tried to block out the disorienting incantations that seemed to close in on him. The 3rd hour is approaching. You must work faster. The doctor tried to blink away the sweat threatening to blind him. Unsuccessful, he swiped under his glasses with the sleeve of his smock. I'm going as fast as I can. I just need quiet. He didn't dare say more. The black robe raised his hand, and immediately the volume decreased. The doctor breathed deeply for oxygen, but doing so made the stench of sweat and blood even more acute. He was desperate not to gag. Finishing the procedure in the remaining time seemed impossible, even if it weren't for the heat, lack of proper equipment, and the decrepit conditions of the abandoned warehouse, where concrete floors were constantly littered with cigarette butts, beer bottles, and the disgusting evidence of sexual indiscretions. If he didn't know better, he would have thought someone had just thrown a frat party in there. And why the blood from the last procedure hadn't been cleaned up was unfathomable. He was a doctor, first and foremost, educated and trained at one of the country's finest medical schools, graduating with distinction. Only his specialty was in thoracic and cardiovascular surgery, not organ transplant. He'd had to undergo years of retraining to perform transplants. But he missed the old days of just fixing what was already there instead of taking things out and putting them back in. Now, the only surgeons who still got work were plastic surgeons and transplant surgeons. Skin, organs, eyes mostly. Out with the old, in with the new. Presto, a new lease on life. He was appalled by the conditions he was forced to work in. Couldn't they be civilized about this? Surely with the affluent clientele they attracted, they could spend a little more for brighter lights, maybe some sterilizing equipment. But then again, he'd heard that this particular liver was for the son of some holy man. How did a holy man manage to pay for this? Holy, as in holy cow, you're rich. Some of them lived in mansions and flew private jets. The giant plastic pump bottle of alcohol sitting on his appliance tray looked sorely archaic. But he said nothing, just pressed onward. If the kidney was not viable because of infection, it wouldn't be his fault. Although it would be a shame to lose the once pretty brunette who lay unconscious beneath him, oblivious to the valuable commodity that was being extracted from her inert body. Overused in sin. Oblivious, that is, for now. He was glad he would not be there when she awoke. Where do they find these people, he wondered. Black market? Kidnapping? He'd know pretty quickly were he to simply turn on the news. But he hated that stuff. Cluttered his mind for more important things like his craft. He didn't get to where he was, at the top of his game, by spending time watching pets skateboard on YouTube. That was for sure. The internet and social media were the new diseases of the 21st century as far as he was concerned. He was glad he was careful to keep his own kid preoccupied with productive things like making music on a violin and putting a ball in a hole in one. Whatever the procurement process, he wasn't involved in it, and he only ever performed surgeries on non-vital organs like eyes, lungs, kidneys. Surgeries where people didn't have to be snuffed, not on purpose. and despite the ridiculous conditions under which he was often forced to perform, he'd only ever had 100% success. So meticulous was he in his execution. 2 weeks ago, at a charity auction ball, he'd had the pleasure of seeing the fruits of his handiwork in the face of the mayor's beautiful teenage daughter. Her renewed vibrancy hit him full force as she was introduced to him in hushed gratitude by her beaming father, an upstanding man who could not bear the incrementally reduced vision of his offspring, the result of a genetic defect. When he saw her coming towards him, her flowing, soft brown hair trailing, framing new eyes with perfect vision, he'd felt a literal thud in his heart. She'd reminded him of his own daughter. Estranged now, over 3 years, upset because they hadn't approved of her boyfriend. They hadn't heard from her since. The police had told them that young people left home all the time. Given the circumstances and the fact that she was of age, there was not much they could do. That boyfriend didn't deserve her. Aimless. She, meanwhile, was an A student, valedictorian of her senior class. He didn't even remember how it happened. Only remembered a lot of crying at first, the Sunday dinners, their only family time, when you could hear a pin drop. Then, during an out-of-town weekend conference, a phone call from his wife. He couldn't believe so much time had passed since she was the little girl who doodled unicorns and squealed when she was able to solve algebraic equations, their little father-daughter pastime. He missed her, even as he thought of her, fingering the trinket around his neck that she'd given him on his 50th birthday. Half of a silver heart on a box chain. She had the other half, round and smooth on one side, a jagged edge on the other that fit his half like a puzzle piece. As cliché as it was, she had thought it was a witty gift for her dad, the heart surgeon. She was sweet and classy, like her mother. From the best blue blood. What fine women he had. Not like the poor mayor, whose wife had been at the benefit too. Bleach blonde, too old and unnaturally tan to be in that low-cut sequin number, in his opinion. She'd been over the top in her praise of his work, so much so that her husband had to quiet her. He could tell that she'd had too much to drink, having watched her nurse a bottomless martini before the first round of auctioning even began. Money couldn't buy class, he mused. The donor for the mayor's daughter had been a young man with 2015 visual acuity, probably his only asset. A strange, sad face, lacking in anything you could grab onto that spoke of life. But then again, they all looked that way, deep in unnatural chloroform-induced sleep, their facial muscles rendered flaccid, making their faces look like oozing, molten lava cakes. Sometimes he'd notice their eyelids flickering as if dreaming. Of course, they'd dream. All people did. But what if that slumber were not the result of the body's natural melatonin production, but rather a consequence of a synthetic chemical equivalent to a sledgehammer to the brain? To sleep, perchance, to dream. Ah, there's the rub. For in this sleep of death, what dreams may come. Damn, he loved that play. Pulse is weak, doctor. How bad? 7742. Give her a shot of phenylephrine. Hope this girl's not on antidepressants. We'll know soon enough. He wouldn't be surprised if she were, though. He never knew where they came from, didn't want to know, but they usually took the ones that no one cared about. The runaways, hobos, preferably not ruined by booze or drugs, but even those who were good for something, like eyes and maybe heart, but he didn't do those. Never family or fixed address. Caused less commotion, and the cops were always keen on closing the case unless anyone complained. Why waste resources on someone no one noticed was even gone? They'd wait a while, of course, let the press have their stories, the chief wax on about justice being served. But in the end, everyone knew cases went unsolved year after year until they'd long faded from the public's memory. Sometimes he'd balk when he recognized the face. It was rare, but it happened before. No one he'd associated with or knew personally, but whom he thought he'd seen around in that smallish town where running into familiar faces was commonplace. It happened last year when he'd received a call about a buyer. Then 2 weeks later, like clockwork, they'd located a donor. These people were efficient and organized, as moronic as they seemed in their silly robes and monosyllabic vocabulary. But sometimes they got stupid or desperate and plucked out someone too close to home. It was a man, a kid really, whom he thought he'd seen hanging out by the theater district when, on weekends, he and his wife would drive into town for dinner and a show. Possibly in his 20s, somewhat clean-cut and average-looking in a baseball cap. He'd have passed for a regular guy had it not been for the same outfit he wore, a gray windbreaker, khakis, and black and white sneakers. Time after time, when he was spotted outside a popular cafe next to the dinner theater, hands in his pockets as if waiting for someone. Someone who never seemed to show up. It was hard to tell whether it was him he saw under the hot, incandescent lamps one night on his procedure table, minus the baseball cap, and feminized in a bouffant surgical cap. The resemblance was vague at best, but he couldn't stomach even that. He'd flat out refused to perform, and luckily, satanic cultists, as impertinent as they sometimes were, thought it sacrilegious for a ritual to be executed without the wholehearted complicity of the performing artist. Even devil worshippers had standards. Who knew? What time is it? 43 minutes to the 3rd hour. Can't these devil types talk like normal people? He detested being rushed on these jobs. This was transplanting a human organ, not Iron Chef. Still, it was a thing of personal pride to get the job done, and in these cases, time was of the essence. A job wasn't done at all if it were not done to the satisfaction of his client, even if they were organ-pillaging agents of the devil himself. After the devil's hour, the sacrifice will be forfeited. He wanted to say, "Oh well, better luck next time, you stupid schmuck." He settled for, "It'll be done. You have my word." He looked down at the pockmarked face of the recipient. In contrast to the donor, he was a fossil. Age 54, father of 2, chief of police. 33 years in the force to serve and protect. It was cases like these that made him wake up in the morning to work another 10-hour day. He recalled the first time he'd been introduced to the higher order. He was in shock, having just got the news that his son had an enlarged heart. Cardiomyopathy. Surely, as a cardiac surgeon, there was something he could do to fix his own son. But there was no cure for enlarged heart syndrome, even when the cause could be determined. He needed a new heart, but getting one would be next to impossible with the interminable wait time, especially given that his blood type was one of the rarest ones, AB negative. What irony could be crueler than to be one of the most respected cardiologists in your field, yet be unable to heal your own son? If he believed in God, he would curse him. But there was no God. He and the profession he represented were the closest thing. It was at a medical conference when he had first heard of the order. A clean-cut young man who professed to be a follower of his published research approached him afterwards and intimated that he'd heard about his son's plight and that he wanted to help. He was shocked at first, then intrigued. other doctors were a part of it. Esteemed doctors, even leaders in their field. With the ever-dwindling supply of voluntary live and deceased donors and society's growing demand for longevity and health, a natural vacuum had formed, one that begged to be filled. The higher order, as it was explained to him, was essentially concerned with justice. Why were there such swarms of the unworthy who, while contributing little, if anything, to the betterment of society, took for granted the incredible gift of physical health? Meanwhile, many of those who added value to the world had to suffer, like his son. The idea of recalibrating the universe excited him. A higher world order. The link to the cultists was merely one of necessity. The order needed to be supplied donors to fulfill its mission, and the black robes had a compatible agenda. One could say it was a mutually beneficial relationship. He was quick to remind himself that he didn't receive a penny from their enterprise, with their idiotic hierarchy of demon worshippers. He wasn't after their blood money. He was a professional. He wouldn't dream to offer his unparalleled service for petty cash, but the knowledge that he was fulfilling a truly higher calling was incomparable. A fair deal, a balancing of the universe, he imagined, some pragmatic philosopher would say. Worthy people got needed extensions on life, lesser people had the privilege of providing it, and talented people like him got to put supernatural skills to good use for the advancement of society, a well-oiled ecosystem. At precisely 16 minutes to 3 a.m., it was done. Of course. The chorus of droning began to rise again. He hated this part. Party time in Helltown. The mass of robed bodies closed in on him, hands stretched out to anoint him, and the inert bodies while declaring, "Ne'er shall we sleep, from the flesh we reap." And on and on. Then inevitably someone always had to kill something, an animal, a cat or stray dog or something. Dig out an organ with their bare hands, usually the same one that had just been transplanted in the human transaction, a kidney or a lung or an eye, and eat it. Stupid and gross, but he was used to it by now. He'd heard of more macabre rituals too, but he'd never personally seen any. Like any good business partner, they knew his limits. As the chanting rose to a deafening pitch, he imagined little red-horned humanoids prancing amongst them, wielding pitchforks like batons, abominably giddy as they jimmied and jived to the cacophonous droning and bizarre bloodletting. But what he actually saw before him were seemingly regular people. People he saw at the Walmart or post office. Sweatshirts and sneakers peeking out from beneath stereotypical black robes purchased from a cheap local store that sold Halloween paraphernalia. Sad, bored chumps who desperately needed something to believe in and belong to. This was the part he needed to mentally disassociate with. His collusion with these stupid sick souls. He wished they would just let him go home now. He needed a shower and a stiff drink. Badly. Before leaving the gruesome scene, he glanced at the clothes on a chair, saw a watch, sneakers and socks on the floor nearby. He swept up the watch as he exited. He was careful not to make a sound as he entered the house. The deadbolt tended to make a loud clicking and reverberated off the marble walls of the foyer, so he held the lock to shut the door. He went up the oak staircase, heading to his bedroom. His wife lay in the dark, eyes covered by a sleep mask. He leaned over to kiss her. She smelled nice with freshly shampooed hair. He looked at the digital clock on his night table. 4:08. He wasn't scheduled for surgery at the hospital until 2 p.m., He could still get 8 hours and have time to spare for his favorite lunch of lox and caviar. In the ensuite shower, hot spray came from all directions. He lathered himself in body wash, breathing in the floral scent. He appreciated the simple things in life: hot showers, scent of flowers, a soft mattress, and his craft, his passion. He toweled himself and stepped into the fluffy bathrobe hanging on the hook. His wife had given it to him as a Valentine's gift. The red embroidery on the breast pocket read, "Surgeon of the Year." He loved his wife. They'd met through a mutual friend during his internship while she was in the nursing program. Over the years, they'd never, or barely ever fought. So compatible they were. Besides being the best in their fields, they both loved tennis and needed no sustenance beyond oak-aged Merlot and a strong Roquefort. He smiled as he recalled one time she'd accused him of cheating when he'd come home one night during the wee hours post-procedure. Her routine was to be in bed by 9:30, and rarely in their 25 years of marriage had she ever deviated from her routine. But she'd had a rare headache one night and had gone to the medicine cabinet just as he'd stepped in. He managed to convince her that he'd been at the hospital for an emergency. Blessed with an infallible good nature, she'd been easily persuaded. He'd often considered telling her of his extracurricular involvements, but he didn't see any point in burdening her with extraneous information that had no bearing on their marriage. By all accounts, he could think of no marriage amongst his surgeon cohorts that was as good as theirs. Not even close. Half of them were divorced and the rest were having affairs. He was a rare, blessed man. Why trouble a good thing? He tiptoed down the hall to his son's room, opened the door. Only the top of his dark head peeked over the covers. His son. In between childhood and manhood, there'd been times of trial for sure. Questionable choice of friends, but nothing major. Just adolescent malaise that got him with the wrong crowd of drugs and raving for a time. But it was nothing an overnight stay in jail couldn't fix. Everyone had to make choices in life, and those choices had consequences. An affectionate and rational kid, it didn't take much for him to come back round. But now, his heart condition was getting worse. He woke after a fitful sleep. Must have been that leftover foie gras he had with the shot of bourbon right before going to sleep the night before. He looked beside him and found his wife was up already. 10:05 a.m. No use trying to sleep anymore. It never happened. Beside the clock was the watch he'd taken from the warehouse the previous night. Swatch. Cheap. Purple. He always liked to keep a memento of his projects to remind him of his productivity whenever he could get his hands on one. Last night was 665. Breakfast was on the table already. He'd been a spoiled man ever since his wife retired early to stay home to care for the family. With his income, there was no reason for her to work. "Sleep all right?" She kissed him and handed him the morning paper. "Not bad." He reached for his coffee mug just as she came to fill it with black, aromatic goodness. He took a careful sip, then dug right into his bacon, eggs, and toast. He was suddenly ravenous. "How was your night?" he asked, in between bites of scrambled eggs. He preferred over easy. Her only flaw. "Exhausting. Marlene was over. She went on and on about her husband, her kids, her job. I swear, that woman thinks she's the only person in the world with issues." She got up to scoop more eggs from the pan for him. I wish she'd ask about me once in a while." He started to tune out. He loved her and was glad she was at home full time, but being married to a homemaker had its drawbacks too. like the breadth of discussion topics. Did I hear the phone this morning? Yes, your cell. I didn't pick up. He loved that she respected his privacy. Sorry, honey, you were saying about Marlene. Never mind. Detecting his wife's annoyance, he got up and embraced her from behind as she emptied the dishwasher. Hey, kids, get a room, will ya? It was their 17-year-old son. Still awkward, but revealing sure signs of manhood like his increasingly angular shoulders and deepening voice. Hey, bud, what you doing up so early? It's called school, Dad. You still want me to go, right? He quipped, peeling a banana. Will be pretty hard for me to be that perfect kid who graduates at the top of my class and wins that full scholarship to Yale like we'd planned if I didn't go to school every day. He beamed as his son leaned in to bear hug both he and his mother, something he did every day since the day he was able to walk. How he lucked out with such a great kid was another thing he knew he'd been blessed with. That's what you get when you work hard all your life and provide the best for your family. Gratitude, a just reward. What do you say I pull you out of class early today and we do a quick round of 9 holes? He did all he could lately to relieve his son of some of the stress of senior year. Don't try to lead me into temptation, Dad. You know I won't fall for it. My perfect genetic makeup of nurse surgeon superblood won't allow it. Right, Mom? The day's surgery was for a double bypass. Textbook. The male patient was in his 30s. Years of poor eating had resulted in an abnormal buildup of arterial plaque. He had never seen such a severe case in so young a person. Consequences. Despite his lack of sleep, the day was a good one. Another successful surgery had ended ahead of schedule. Then off to a pub with a colleague afterwards, and they had laughs over Sapporos. It was a Tuesday when he got a call as he was pulling up on his driveway. A reaping. He preferred a procedure, but okay. When? Tonight? What? I told you I need more notice than that. Silence. Hello? Tonight. It must conclude by, yes, I know, the 3rd hour. He racked his brain for an excuse to his wife. They were supposed to go to her mother's for dinner. Maybe he could slip out early. What type? Heart. What? They knew he didn't do hearts. Kidney, lungs, eyes, that's it, no hearts. Only non-vitals. I don't do those. Silence. Hello? You know I don't do those. I think you might. No, I won't. I think you might reconsider. He sighed. What did these people not understand? Look, one of our associates has confirmed the donor's blood type, AB negative. AB negative. AB negative. The words had been ringing in his mind for so long that had begun to sound like the faraway chiming you hear sometimes after a fever or a jolt to the head, one that you wondered if real or imagined. Did he really just hear him say AB negative? Will you reconsider? It was a statement, not a question. Are you saying, is this? Yes. He stood in his driveway, holding his phone in one hand, briefcase in the other, frozen in disbelief. He never quite thought about what he'd do in this situation. Never imagined it would happen like this, but he knew that it was possible. And now the day had come, and he didn't know what to do. A heart. He remembered his first extracurricular procedure. It had been nerve-wracking, performed in an old building on the edge of town that had been abandoned for years. It had been a kidney, the recipient, the 4-year-old son of a banker. He'd had no idea who the donor was, hadn't asked questions. Then he'd held his breath and did it. First time was always hard. He thought about the wait list. There was no jumping the queue, even if the perfect donor could be found on time. Does it have to be me? Couldn't. It's yours. He sighed again. At least he could make sure it was done properly, that nothing was damaged in the process. First time was always hard. Fine. Silence. Hesitantly. Thank you for... Click. He told his wife he needed to meet their accountant. He had just enough time to taste the peach cobbler before slipping out the door. The warehouse was dark as usual, illuminated only by spotlights focused on the operating tables. The devil's minions were in full gear as expected, but they seemed particularly animated that night. A few of them were engulfed in ecstatic convulsions, some drooling or foaming at the mouth, uttering unintelligibles in a high-pitched shrieking. In another corner, a naked woman rocked and quivered grotesquely as if in a trance, wielding switchblades like a windmill. Every now and then, her erratic performance was punctuated by random self-slashing, creating wounds that eager mouths lapped at. He wondered if it was his imagination, but he thought they were hovering nearer to him than usual, short of making contact but waving their hands over him as if attempting to penetrate an invisible aura. That's new. Whatever. He wasn't there to analyze deviant, devil-worshipping behavior. He chuckled at the irony. What was normal devil-worshipping behavior? He had a job to do, and as per usual, he was under a time constraint. He hurried to the industrial sinks, washed his hands, and donned his gloves and scrubs. He approached the hot lights where the donor lay on a table. It had been anesthetized ahead of time. Vitals? Checked. Ready. His heart pounded. First time. It'll be done soon. Then I can go. At least his son didn't have to be there. This vile place where the lowly practiced sacrilege. He'd made arrangements. A favor. Perks of having colleagues with the same extracurricular activities. At that very moment, his precious son was safely tucked away under general anesthesia, dreaming sunny dreams of life without restraints, while his new heart was being excised and prepared for insertion. A gift of life from his daddy. He was grateful for the dim lights that obscured everything except the relevant parts of the body. The donor was female. Judging by the skin on her chest, she could be anywhere between 20 and 30. Still at peak. His peripheral faded to darkness as his hand hovered over the spot marked X on the breastbone. First time. Blade descended on flesh. The skin parted effortlessly. He always liked the feel of human skin yielding to his razor-sharp scalpel in a way that a laser could never replicate. It was the next part he didn't like, the breaking and parting of the breastbone. But this one was easy, snapped more like cartilage than bone. Must be young. Then there it was, the human heart. All of life wrapped up in one small sack of pulsating cells, the control center of a complex system of blood vessels that, if unwound, would amount to a distance of more than 100,000 miles, more than 4 times around the earth. Cradling it for a brief, admiring moment of awe, he felt its power. That he was maestro over it momentarily took his breath away. He gently placed it on ice and closed the box that looked like it could be used to transport beer to a house party. He was glad when it was over. First time. Done. His son would be fine. The surreal joy of it was so potent that he barely noticed the chanting that had risen to a crushing crescendo. Ne'er shall we sleep from the flesh we reap. Ne'er shall we sleep from the flesh we reap. The Grand Master of Ceremonies, who stood, inanimate, at the center of the unusually ecstatic celebration, caught his gaze, held it. The circular cutlets around his eyes on the black hood were wide enough to reveal heavy bags beneath gray eyes. They seemed to bore into him that evening. The black hood even turned its head to follow him as he moved towards the industrial sink, as if observing him for some reaction. Like a chemist who had added a new substance to a test tube and awaited the result with eager curiosity. He didn't know what to make of it, but he didn't want to get caught up in the après-op festivities. The last thing he needed after that last nerve-wracking procedure was to witness the slaughter of another poor animal. He washed up quickly to leave, but not before reaching for the trinket that shone on top of the blue jeans and jacket, strewn on a chair. He hesitated a split second, then scooped it up. It was a job after all, although he suddenly lost count. He had to hurry to where his son was, over an hour away on the outskirts of town where his colleague lived. He hurried toward his parked car, gripped tightly the plastic handle that held the prize that he only now just realized was what his life had been leading up to all these years. All those years of study and practice, sleepless nights, holding himself to the highest standards, all crescendo to that one pivotal moment, the moment that he would be savior to his son. Maybe, even, this would be the last time he did this. He fantasized about where he might take his family for that long-delayed vacation. India, Dubai, exotic lands were the preference of his wife and son, while he preferred the mindlessness of a Mediterranean cruise, the type of vacation where he didn't have to think about where to go, how he'd get there, or where to sleep at night without getting mugged or robbed or sold into slavery. He'd heard Cambodia now had first-class, all-inclusives. That could be the perfect compromise. Lost in thoughts of exotic food and sunny beaches, he fingered the trinket that he'd slipped into his trouser pocket. Metallic. What number was it that he was at again? 660. Round and smooth on one side. A jagged edge. Bile rose. Projectile vomit spewed from his gut. He clawed at his heart. As of 2018, it was estimated that the illegal organ trade conservatively generates approximately $840 million to $1.7 billion annually, according to Global Financial Integrity. Quote, organ traffickers profit in the shadows, while their destructive medical footprint is the only thing that is felt. It leaves vulnerable populations, aka donors, and first world beneficiaries, aka recipients, open to severe exploitation and a lifetime of health consequences. That is from the Organ Trafficking, Unseen Form of Human Trafficking. There has also been compelling evidence of forced organ transplants of organs from living donors, killing them in the process. NBCnews.com.